February 6, 2026. Sunland, California. 7:47 a.m. A 70-year-old grandfather drops off his 10-year-old granddaughter for school. It's a Thursday morning. Ordinary. Routine. In the next 8 seconds, everything changes. A blade to the neck. Blood pouring. And still, he doesn't let go of her.
Chilling video from a violent early morning attack in the Sunland neighborhood. A grandfather stabbed in the neck, his granddaughter with slash wounds to her arm. Both bleeding as family members scream in shock. We've blurred some of the images. A neighbor who residents say is mentally ill and who has been terrorizing this community for years stabbed the victims as a grandfather was taking his grandchild to school. You see them walking down this driveway.
This is the story of Eric Avilez, a 31-year-old man with untreated mental illness, a family begging for help, a neighborhood screaming warnings, and a system that looked the other way. Because here's what makes this truly devastating. This wasn't the first time. The 10300 block of Eldora Avenue in Sunland, a quiet residential street in the San Fernando Valley, the kind of neighborhood where people know each other's names, where kids ride bikes, where Ring doorbells capture package deliveries and birthday parties, and sometimes nightmares. Thursday, February 6, 2026. Around 7:45 in the morning, a grandfather, whose name hasn't been publicly released to protect the family, is doing what he's probably done 100 times before, dropping his 10-year-old granddaughter off for school. The little girl is in the car, backpack ready. Just another Thursday. And then, from the side of the frame, a man approaches. His name is Eric Avilez. He's 31 years old. He lives in the neighborhood, and he's holding a knife. What happens next unfolds in seconds, but I need you to understand each moment, because in this moment, a choice is made. Eric approaches the vehicle. The grandfather sees him. There's no time to process, no time to think. Eric lunges, and the blade enters the grandfather's neck. A stab wound to the neck, one of the most vulnerable, deadly places on the human body. Blood immediately begins pouring from the wound. The carotid artery, the jugular vein. Puncture either one, and you have minutes, maybe less, before you bleed out. And in that moment, bleeding, in shock, in pain, the grandfather doesn't run. He doesn't freeze. He reaches into the car and pulls his granddaughter out of harm's way. She's screaming. She's been stabbed, too, in the arm. Eric Avilez has attacked a 10-year-old child, but her grandfather, blood streaming down his neck, places himself between her and the attacker. Eric then makes his next move. He gets into the family's silver Volvo sedan, left running, keys in the ignition, and he drives away. He flees the scene in the stolen vehicle, leaving behind a bleeding elderly man and a traumatized child. Emergency responders arrive within minutes. The grandfather is rushed to the hospital with a stab wound to the neck. The little girl, stabbed in the arm, is also transported. Both survive, but the physical wounds, those will heal. The psychological scars of this morning, those are permanent. Los Angeles Police Department immediately issues a public alert. Armed and dangerous suspect. Stolen vehicle. The entire San Fernando Valley is on edge. At approximately 4:30 p.m., nearly 9 hours after the attack, Eric Avilez is located and arrested in the stolen Volvo. He's taken into custody without further incident, booked for attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, child abuse, and carjacking. But here's where this story stops being about one attack and becomes about a pattern. Eric Avilez, 31 years old, a resident of the Sunland community, and according to everyone who knew him, including his own family, a man in the grip of severe, untreated mental illness. Neighbors describe him as troubled, unstable, someone who needed help. Some residents reported seeing Eric exhibiting concerning behavior in the neighborhood, watching over fences, appearing agitated, mumbling to himself. But perhaps the most heartbreaking perspective comes from Eric's own brother, Esteban Avilez. In an interview with ABC 7, Esteban appeared outside the family home, visibly emotional. and said something that cuts to the heart of this tragedy. Someone told him he doesn't have to take his medication. Someone told him he doesn't have to take his medication. Esteban apologized to the victims, to the community. He explained that the family had been struggling, trying to get Eric help, trying to keep him on his medication regimen, trying to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. Now, let's be clear about something. Mental illness does not equal violence. The vast majority of people living with mental health conditions are not dangerous. In fact, they're far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. But untreated, severe mental illness, particularly conditions involving psychosis, paranoia, or delusional thinking, can, in rare cases, lead to violent behavior, especially when combined with medication noncompliance. Eric's family knew this. They were living this. And according to Esteban's statement, they were trying to get Eric help. But here's the cruel irony of our mental health system. You can't force someone to take medication. You can't involuntarily commit someone unless they meet very specific criteria. And you certainly can't predict when someone will snap. The Avilez family was stuck in an impossible position, watching their loved one deteriorate, knowing the danger, unable to force intervention. And so was the neighborhood, because this wasn't Eric's first incident on Eldora Avenue. Not even close. August 2025, 6 months before the stabbing. According to neighbors and news reports, Eric Avilez allegedly attempted to grab the same little girl, the 10-year-old who would later be stabbed in the arm, the same child, 6 months earlier. Neighbors reported the incident. The family was terrified, and nothing happened. But it wasn't just one incident. According to multiple residents interviewed by local news, ABC 7, KTLA, Fox 11, neighbors have been complaining about Eric's behavior for months. Residents reported seeing Eric taking photos of children, watching them over fences, exhibiting erratic behavior in the streets. Some neighbors captured footage on their home security systems. Video of Eric standing outside homes, peering into yards, acting in ways that made parents pull their children inside. Multiple 911 calls were made. Multiple reports filed. The community was screaming for intervention. And here's what happened. Nothing. Now, let's be fair. Police respond to thousands of calls about suspicious persons. They can't arrest someone for acting weird. They can't force someone into treatment without meeting California's stringent involuntary hold criteria. Under California Welfare and Institutions Code 5150, a person can only be involuntarily detained for psychiatric evaluation if they are deemed a danger to themselves or others or gravely disabled. But determining that's the impossible part. So the calls kept coming. The reports kept piling up. And Eric Avilez remained free in the neighborhood. But here's where it gets even more frustrating. According to reports, Eric had been arrested before. In fact, just months before the February 6th attack, he'd had contact with law enforcement. He was arrested, booked, and then, according to his brother's interview, released after just 3 days, /3 days. This is the revolving door of our justice system when it intersects with mental health crisis. Arrest without treatment, release without support, and the cycle continues. So the residents of Eldora Avenue were left in limbo. They'd reported the behavior. They'd made the calls. They'd done everything right. And on February 6, 2026, their worst fears came true. 70-year-old man was stabbed in the neck. A 10-year-old girl was stabbed in the arm. A family's car was stolen. A community was traumatized. And when the news cameras showed up, when reporters asked neighbors how they felt, the response was universal. We knew something like this would happen. We tried to warn people. Someone should have done something. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about why someone should have done something and why they didn't. California's mental health system is broken. That's not hyperbole. That's not political. That's fact. California has an estimated 1.2 million adults living with serious mental illness. Of those, hundreds of thousands are untreated or undertreated. The state ranks near the bottom nationally for psychiatric beds per capita. We have some of the strictest involuntary commitment laws in the country. And we have a mental health workforce shortage that leaves patients waiting months, sometimes years, for care. Let's break down the legal barriers that allowed Eric Avilez to remain in the community despite multiple warnings. California Welfare and Institutions Code 5150. This is a law that allows police or medical professionals to place someone on an involuntary psychiatric hold for up to 72 hours. But to qualify for a 5150, the person must meet one of these criteria. 1. They are a danger to themselves. 2. They are a danger to others. 3. They are gravely disabled, unable to provide for their own food, clothing, or shelter. Sounds straightforward, right? If someone has a history of aggression, if neighbors are afraid, if there was a previous alleged attempted abduction, surely that qualifies as danger to others? Not necessarily. The determination of danger requires imminent threat. Past behavior doesn't automatically qualify. Intent must be established, and all of this must be documented by a qualified professional. So when police respond to a 911 call about suspicious behavior, they're making a judgment call in real time. Does this person meet 5,150 criteria? Can we prove imminent danger? Will this hold up? And if they guess wrong, if they place someone on a hold who doesn't meet criteria, that's a violation of civil rights. That's a lawsuit. This is the impossible balance. Civil liberties versus public safety. Organizations like the ACLU and Disability Rights California argue, rightfully, that people with mental illness deserve autonomy. They have the right to refuse treatment, the right to live in the community, the right not to be locked away simply for being different or difficult. But victims' rights groups and community safety advocates argue, also rightfully, that when someone poses a clear, demonstrated threat, intervention should be easier, that public safety must be weighed against individual autonomy. So where does that leave the Avilez family? Watching their son deteriorate, unable to force medication. Where does that leave the Eldora Avenue neighbors? Calling 911 repeatedly, watching nothing change. Where does that leave the grandfather and his granddaughter, bleeding on a suburban street because someone told him he doesn't have to take his medication? It leaves them victims of a system designed to fail everyone. Here's the cycle. Someone with severe mental illness commits a crime. They're arrested. They're found incompetent to stand trial. They're sent to a state psychiatric facility where they wait months, sometimes years, for a bed. California state psychiatric hospitals are so overcrowded that defendants wait an average of 8 to 12 months for competency treatment. During that time, they're often held in county jails, which are not equipped for psychiatric care. If and when they're restored to competency, they're released back to the community, often with prescription and a court order to take medication. But there's no mechanism to enforce compliance, no mandatory follow-up, no long-term case management unless the family can afford private care. And the cycle begins again. Now, California does have a mechanism for long-term intervention, conservatorship. This is a legal process where a court appoints someone, usually a family member, to make decisions for a person who cannot care for themselves. You might have heard of this in the context of Britney Spears' case, which brought national attention to conservatorship abuse. But here's the reality. Conservatorship are expensive, time-consuming, and extraordinarily difficult to obtain. The person must be proven gravely disabled, unable to meet their own basic needs. Simply being dangerous isn't enough. Families must hire attorneys, attend multiple court hearings, provide extensive documentation, and even then many petitions are denied. The Avilez family may have tried this route. We don't know. What we do know is that by February 6, 2026, Eric Avilez was not under conservatorship. He was not in treatment, and he was armed with a knife on a residential street. So what happens now? Let's start with the victims, because in stories like this, they often get lost in the debate. The grandfather, whose identity remains protected, survived the stabbing to his neck. According to news reports, he required emergency medical treatment, but is expected to make a physical recovery. Physical being the operative word. The 10-year-old girl suffered a stab wound to her arm. She's also expected to physically recover, but the psychological impact of being attacked, of watching her grandfather bleed, of being targeted twice by the same man. That's a different story. Studies show that children who experience violent trauma have significantly higher rates of PTSD, anxiety, depression, and attachment disorders. This little girl will likely carry February 6 with her for the rest of her life. The Sunland community has rallied around the family. Neighbors who once felt helpless now feel heartbroken. The street where children used to play freely is now a reminder of systemic failure. As for Eric Avilez, he remains in custody as of this recording. He faces multiple felony charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, child abuse, and carjacking. But here's the legal complication. Eric will almost certainly undergo a competency evaluation. If he's found incompetent to stand trial, which, given his documented mental illness, is likely, he'll be sent to a state psychiatric facility for competency restoration, where he'll wait months for treatment, where he'll eventually be restored to competency, where he'll return to court, where he'll potentially be convicted, where he'll serve time, and then he'll be released back into the community, unless something changes. California is currently debating several mental health reform measures. Senate Bill 43, passed in 2023, expanded the definition of gravely disabled to include individuals unable to provide for their own personal safety. But implementation has been slow, and funding remains inadequate. Proposition 1, approved by voters in March 2024, authorized $6.38 billion in bonds for mental health facilities and housing. But building infrastructure takes years. And in the meantime, cases like this keep happening. This isn't just a California problem. It's a national crisis. Nationally, nearly 1 in 5 adults experience mental illness each year, but only 47% receive treatment. The intersection of untreated mental illness and the criminal justice system is overcrowded, underfunded, and inadequate. So what could have prevented February 6? Better funding for community mental health services, more psychiatric beds, easier pathways to involuntary treatment when danger is imminent, mandatory medication compliance monitoring for high-risk individuals, better training for law enforcement in mental health crisis response. But also, and this is crucial, better support for families like the Avilez family, respite care, case management, legal assistance with conservatorship, and compassion instead of stigma. Because Esteban Avilez's anguish in that interview, that's real. His brother is going to prison. His victims are traumatized, and his family has been living this nightmare for years. This is a story with no villains, only victims, and a system that failed them all. February 6, 2026, 7:47 a.m., 8 seconds that changed lives forever. A 70-year-old grandfather, stabbed in the neck, bleeding, in shock, chose to protect his granddaughter instead of himself. That's heroism. That's love. That's what it looks like when the system fails and ordinary people have to become extraordinary. The residents of Eldora Avenue will never forget. They warned everyone who would listen. They made the calls. They filed the reports. They did everything right. And it wasn't enough. This case isn't unique. Across California, across America, this pattern repeats. Untreated mental illness. Warning signs ignored. Families desperate for help. Communities living in fear. And then, inevitably, tragedy. But it doesn't have to be this way. If this story makes you angry, good. Channel that anger into action. Contact your state representatives. Demand funding for mental health services. Support organizations like NAMI, Mental Health America, and Disability Rights California. Vote for ballot measures that fund treatment, not just incarceration. If you want to support the victims of this case, keep their names and privacy sacred. Respect their trauma. And advocate for a world where this doesn't happen to the next family. 8 seconds of footage. 6 months of warnings. Years of systemic failure. A grandfather shouldn't have to be a hero. He should have been protected by the system we all pay into. So should his granddaughter. So should the Avilez family. So should we all. This channel exists to tell these stories. Not for clicks. Not for views. But because accountability demands witness. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe. Because I'm not stopping. These victims deserve to be heard. These failures deserve to be exposed. And these systems, they will change. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.